All right, welcome to Module 6. So today we're going to be focusing in this module on our health and accident and sickness insurance provisions, riders as well. So we first want to take a look at some of the provisions that we've already gone to review when we talk about life insurance. So if we remember from life insurance, we have gone through all of these provisions already. And so with health insurance, it's important that we review these again because they also apply to our health insurance policies as well. So this includes the entire contract, the incontestable period, the grace period, reinstatement, modes of payment, change of beneficiary, misstatement of age and gender, insuring clause, free look, consideration clause, waiver of premium, and guaranteed insurability rider. So it's important that we understand the purpose of these provisions and we can apply them into a health insurance context as well. And so to do that, we can just take a moment to complete some of these questions together. And so if we look at the first one here, which of the provision includes an exception to the incontestability clause, and what does it state? Well, we can go back to refer and review our misstatement of age and gender provision, right? So this would be our misstatement of age and gender provision. And so what this provision states is that whenever there is that misstatement of age or gender on an application, right, the insured has the ability to adjust the premiums to reflect the actual age, right, not the misstated age. Number two, right, what provision includes this information? We can see that we have our misstatement of age. That was first one. And then second one, we would have our change of beneficiary. So what provision includes information on this? That would be change of beneficiary. So we write that down here. Okay. And so if we go back to review what these designations mean, hopefully we remember that a revocable designation means that the policy owner is able to change the beneficiary without the beneficiary's prior consent. And irrevocable means that the policy owner cannot change the beneficiary without their consent. And so we can see how this also applies to health insurance, right? Because with health insurance, we also have beneficiaries as well, just like with life insurance. All right. And then for our third provision, we have which one mentioned that one has 10 days to look over a policy and decide to keep it or not. So that would refer back to our free look period. Okay. So on this chart here, it's listed as number 9 there. So our free look period or free look clause, right, states that you have 10 days to look over a policy, right? And it's kind of that period where one can decide, should I keep it or should I not? And number 4, can a company usually contest information by a policy owner after 4 days of policy issue date? What provision mentions this? And the answer is no, right? Because of the incontestability clause or period, right? And we know that usually that places a limit on around 3 years, right? And so after 4 years, usually except for fraud, the company or the insurer cannot contest the information. So that's the incontestability clause or period. And then for our fifth question here, what is exchange that the insurance company and the policy owner provide to each other? And which provision mentions this? Well, for the insurance company, right, that would be that promise to pay the benefits. So for health insurance, it would be, right, paying benefits for claims. For life insurance, we looked at, it was the death benefit. Then policy owner, it would be, right, those premium payments, right? Okay. And the provision, right, if we go back to looking at that, we would have go back to our chart, our consideration clause, right? That would be our consideration clause, which states that. All right. So those are some of the review kind of questions that kind of guides you to really taking a look at reviewing those provisions that we've talked about before. Because in Module 6, we add on to health insurance provisions, right? We add on those provisions that are unique to health insurance. So let's get started to taking a look at those. All right. So remember, when we talk about health insurance, the main thing is we want to take a look at the claims process, right? So if we have, even if you think about it in terms of like a car accident, right? We would then have filing of claim, right? We'd have to verify the accident, verify the injury, right? So we need to talk about all of those provisions that are in place and implemented in order from the start, right, of the filing of the claim all the way to when the benefits are paid out. So we first have the notice, right? The notice of claim provision. And so this is where we have the policy owner's obligation to notify the company of the claim within a reasonable period of time, right? And that's usually 20 days after the loss, right? Or the occurrence. So we first had that notice of 20 days. Then we have that claims forms. So this provision states that the company needs to provide the insured within 50 days of receiving the claim, of receiving the notice, okay, and supply the policy owner with a claims form. So what does this form do? Well, this form allows one to fill out essential information, right? So we can see that the policy owner would fill out some of the details of the insured or of themselves if they are also the policy owner. And they would also fill out some information regarding what happened during the accident, right? Possible medical costs that were incurred. Okay, so kind of that claims form that the insurer sends out to the insured. So after we have the notice and after we have the forms, we have the proof of loss, right? So yeah, the insured or the policy owner has to provide some sort of proof, right, that the loss actually occurred. So to do that, the claimant, right, has 90 days to submit that proof of loss from the date of the loss. Okay. So 90 days to submit proof of loss from the date of the loss. Okay. And then once, right, we have that proof, right, once the insurance company has that proof, then the time of payment of claims provision states that there should be a immediate payment of claims, right, by the insurer to the insured. Okay. So kind of see that there's this process, right? Of, okay, we first have that notice, and then we go through these processes of forms, of proof, and then eventually we have the payment of the claim or the benefits. We also have another provision that states the payment of claims, right? Just that this specifies, right, to who and how the payments are made. And so this more talks about not about the time, right, but more about, am I going to pay these benefits out through periodic payments or a lump sum, right? To whom should we be paying this to, right? And so this just specifies that because it's important that we do, right, in these contracts. Okay. And then lastly, we have the legal actions provision. Okay. So this is where the insured cannot take legal action against the company in a claims dispute, right? Which does happen sometimes until after 60 days from the time the insured submits the proof of loss. Okay, so 60 days from the time the insured submits the proof of loss. And so what we really want to know about this is that it's not a complicated process, right? We have a couple of provisions that are specific to health insurance, but we want to make sure that we know the facts, right? So how many days? They like to test on that. How many days after this can the insured take legal action, right? How many days after loss or after the notice of loss does the insurer or the insurance company have to provide the claims for? So we want to take a look at kind of a summary, right, of when these steps occur, right? So notice of claim, 20 days from accident, claims form, 50 days after claims notice, proof of loss, 90 days from accident, and legal action, 60 days from proof of loss. Okay. So we can see that, right, with these provisions, we're able to organize, right, steps from the notice to the legal action. So make sure that you know about this and kind of make yourself some notes with the facts and from where, right? Is it from the accident, right, or from the proof of loss? That's important as well. Okay. So those were mainly provisions that focused on the claims, right? The claims aspect, which is very important. But we also have some other provisions that we want to notice as well. So first, we have the physical examination and autopsy provision. And so oftentimes, right, the insurance company might want to examine, right, the insured to really see, right, the extent, right, of the injuries that the insured got at the time of the accident. If there was some sort of right death that occurred, right, the insurance company might want to perform an autopsy, right, to analyze the cause of death, right, to analyze the severity of the accident. And so, in most cases, at their own expense, they're able to do that, okay, during the period of a claim, unless it's forbidden by a state law. Now, when we also talk about health insurance, we also want to take a look at change of occupation, right? So when we look at life insurance in the previous modules, right,
Excuse
it
me,
didn't
Jason.
really matter that much at first on whether or not we look at if the insured changes in occupation, right? But with health insurance, we really want to focus on, right, if the insured changes occupation, is that going to cause more risk, right, for the insurance company? And it is, because if they switch to a more hazardous occupation, such as working from a fast food restaurant to going into construction, right, or going abroad into a more dangerous region, possibly, right, that would cause, right, a reduction in the maximum benefit payable, right? So the insured might have to take on a greater risk, and so then they will reduce the maximum benefit payable. Okay. Now, if we switch to a less hazardous occupation, right? So if you decide to retire partially and you start working at, Starbucks, something like that, from your more dangerous previous job, then you might not have to pay so much premium, right? Because there's less risk for the insurer, right? And so when we talk about health insurance, right, it's important that we look especially at occupational change, because that's directly related to whether or not you're more likely to suffer accidents, especially in an occupational setting, right? Okay. Now, when we talk about illegal occupation, right, we know that even when we looked at life insurance, right, whenever the insured, right, participates in any sort of illegal occupation, right, there won't be any death benefits paid out due to the death, right, of related to that illegal activity. So that applies the same to health insurance, right? The insurer is not liable for any losses, right? Not liable for any losses attributed to the insured being connected to, right, illegal activity, right, or illegal occupation. Okay. So now when you look at the relation of earnings to insurance provision, so this provision states that the policyholder cannot receive more benefits than their monthly income at the time they became disabled. So a major thing that we really want to look at is that we want to avoid like this duplication of benefits, right? And so this relation of earnings to insurance states that if the policyholder has more than one policy, right, each insurance company will pay a proportionate share of the benefit. So this helps to reduce that duplication that might occur. So a good example is, right, if the policy holder used to earn like 2,500 a month, and now, right, after their disability, they only earn 3,000, right? And they have two policies, right? A hypothetical scenario, right? Just an example of what it means as a proportionate share might be that each policy, right? Each policy pays out, $250, right? And so this is what it means by, in simple terms, what it means when we talk about a proportionate share, right? Instead of each policy paying 500, right? Each policy would only pay 250. So then that would cover, right, 250 times 2, that would cover that $500 loss, right, due to the disability. Okay, so that's kind of what it means when we talk about proportionate share of benefits.
Jason,
Yes, go ahead.
would that mean that if you had the policy with the same company or with a different company, that they would have to, does that provision apply? You're saying that if you had two benefits from the same company, then they would have to do a proportional. But what if you were with two different companies? The
Mhm.
same provision applies?
Yes, as long as the policies cover the same disability.
Okay.
Yeah. So as long as the policies still cover the same disability, right, those policies would be paying a proportionate share. Exactly. All right. So now let's take a minute to complete a midpoint checkup. You see, if we remember, first, right, our claims provisions, and number 2, right, we have a question on kind of a review on the consideration clause, but we're applying it to a health and accident policy context. So, ahead, take a moment to look through these, and then we'll go over it shortly. Okay, so let's go over them now. So for number 1, right, an insurer must provide claims forms to an insured within a maximum of how many days after receiving notice of a accident and health claim. Okay, so when we take a look at this, we want to look at going back with our to our like summary chart, right? That I provided. And if we go back to refer, right, to those dates, right, it would be 15, right? So 15 days. Okay. For number two, right, the consideration clause, right? So remember, this states that both parties would provide something in exchange, right? And so in this case, we would have, right, the applicant paying the premiums, right? Or paying the initial premium. That would all fall under, right, the consideration brought by the applicant or the insured. Okay. All right. So now, two more here. So now when we're taking a look still at these claims provisions, as we know, they're very important because they apply specifically to our health insurance policies. So go ahead and take a look at this, and then we'll go over it shortly. All right. Let's take a look at our third question here. So we're taking a look at which of the following provision designates to whom claim payments are made. So with this one, if we look at remembering our payment of claims provision, right? This states to whom our right claim benefits are being paid to and how, right? So the to whom and the how. And number four, right? If we take a look back at the summary chart, right, the insured cannot take legal action against the company in a claims dispute until 60 days after, right, receiving that proof of loss. So yes, we want to go back to refer to that. We want to make sure we know about our dates as well. And we also want to know, right, from what time, right? So 15 days from when? 60 days from when? All right. So now we'll continue on to looking at our probationary and elimination periods. So what we want to know about this is that they are different. And so hopefully we, as I explained through them, we want to notice why are they different? Because they represent different periods in time. So the probationary period is the time before an insurance company policy can effectively cover a risk. So this is usually between the approval of an insurance application and the actual date the coverage begins. So the probationary period, in simple terms, acts like that waiting period, right? So the application has been approved, but you can really only start receiving payments from claims, and the coverage really actually begins maybe 30 days, 60 days after that approval, right? So this period provides some sort of buffer for the insurance company to reduce risk, right? So we've looked at a trend, especially with life insurance as well, when we looked at how insurance companies try to minimize risk and reduce costs, right? And so oftentimes we might have clients who receive an approval of insurance application and they automatically immediately start to filing claims, start to attempt to receive benefits. But these waiting periods are implemented in order to prevent that, right? And so it's kind of like that waiting period can kind of relate that, right? When we're trying to memorize what it means. Now, the elimination period is the length of time between the beginning of an injury, right, and receiving benefit payments from an insurer. Okay, so this is different, right, from the probationary period because it starts from the beginning of an injury or illness, right, and it ends, whenever the insured can start receiving benefit payments from the insurer. So we've looked at in previous modules what a deductible, what coinsurance, and what co-payments were. And something interesting is that elimination period can act as a deductible. So what that means is instead of paying a deductible, right, before receiving benefit payments, right, the elimination period itself can act as that deductible. Okay, so that's really effective because this period, right, still in a way forces the insured, right, to pay for all of the expenses within the period, right? So beginning from the injury, maybe for 30 days, for example, right? And it can be longer or shorter depending on the severity of the injury, right? But during that time, for example, the insured would have to pay out-of-pocket costs, right? Because they are not allowed to receive any benefits during that period until, right, they can, right? Until they can receive benefits. Maybe once those 30 days pass, right? Once those 60 days pass, and it really just depends, as I mentioned, on the severity of the accident, right? And the or the illness. Okay. So we can see this, right, in long-term care where we talked about it way back in the previous modules. We can look at that with disability insurance, where we've talked about that not a long time ago either. And so with this, right, it's important just to know that we can act as that deductible and that the elimination period and the probationary period are different. Okay, so now let's take a look at some exclusions, limitations, and pre-existing conditions. So just like with life insurance, right, there are certain causes of death that are not covered, right? So, for example, right, when we talked about life insurance, when someone passes away due to going to war, right, passes away due to self-inflicted injuries such as suicide, passes away from dangerous occupations such as aviation related um, occupation, right? In those cases, right, the insurance company will not cover, right, the death. And so we can apply that to health insurance, right? So in any of these cases too, right, as I mentioned, like war, right, self-inflicted injuries, right, serving as a pilot, or remember, injuries that are incurred um, during, right, this time is usually not covered, right? So life insurance, it would be about, right, not paying the death benefits. Health insurance, it would be, right, not paying the claim benefits, right, due to these causes. Okay. And also, a lot of policies contain a benefit limitation on pre-existing conditions, right? So we looked at an example earlier on, if you were born with a heart murmur, right? If you were born with some sort of illness, right, that would, right, eventually rack up a lot of costs, right, and that would present a lot of risk for the insurance company, right? There would be some sort of benefit limitation, right, as well. So we can see that no matter if we're talking about health insurance or life insurance, this still applies in either case. So now we look at our eligible expenses provision. So this provision specifies, right, what are the eligible expenses, right? What are the eligible expenses? Because again, we have to look back at, right, risk management, right, for the insurance company, right? They need to analyze and think about how much are we actually going to cover. And so we need to think about eligible expenses, right? Does the insured really need a private room, or is a semi-private room enough? right? There's also other expenses that we can look at, right? When we take a look at our next slide, when we look at, well, what are the medically necessary procedures, right? Is cosmetic surgery really medically necessary for us to cover that? Right? In most cases, it's not. That's why with cosmetic surgery, right, we see that the majority of those surgeries are funded through like out-of-pocket costs, right? And the insured usually doesn't receive any benefits from those type of surgeries. So that brings us to, in a moment, we're going to look at our pre-certification requirements. But just to add on here, I do want to take a moment to take a look at our co-payment provision. So co-payment is a fixed amount for a covered service, right? So even though, right, the insurance company might cover a semi-private room, right? They might cover, you going to your doctor's office, right, doing the checkups. But oftentimes, a lot of insurance policies require the patient, right, with the client to pay a fixed amount before receiving the service, right? So you yourself might have experienced this, right? You might have gone to a doctor's office and you might have to co-pay, right? You might have gone to the pharmacy and you might have to pay a fixed amount for that particular medication, right? So the insurance company, they cover, right? They recognize that it's an eligible expense, right? And they cover that, but you still need to pay a fixed amount before receiving, right, that medicine, before, right, the doctor treatment. And we need to recognize that's different, right, from coinsurance. If we looked at coinsurance, we looked at the 80-20 split, right? We looked at calculations with coinsurance. And so coinsurance is more of, a percentage that the insured has to pay. Copayment is more of a fixed amount, right? That a patient needs to pay before a covered service. And so in reality, right, if we looked at these health insurance policies, we need to take account of deductibles, coinsurance, and copayment, right? Those are the three major expenses, right, that the insured would need to pay for a covered service, okay? Okay, so now when we look at our pre-authorization and prior approval requirements, and that this kind of relates to, right, our eligible expenses provision, right? Right, to control claims and prevent unnecessary medical costs, right? The insurance company, right, implements these provisions to require policyholders to obtain approval from the insurer, right, or maybe from the primary care physician, right, before entering a hospital for these surgeries. So oftentimes there would be something called a pre-certification that's required to really look at whether or not a requested treatment is medically necessary. So, right, we've looked at how cosmetic surgery is really not medically necessary, right? Most cases. But with some other types of surgery, right, that might be required in terms of if you have a heart condition and you might need that surgery for that, right, then that might go through, right? That's this pre-certification because that might be medically necessary, right? And it really just depends case by case, right? The insurance company, right, and the physicians and the hospital, right, have that communication to really look at, right, the patients or the client's medical history and see if it's medically necessary. And then our last provision here is our unreasonable or unusual, reasonable, and customary charges. So if we look at right, the cost of living, just in general, between Georgia and California, right, we can see that for sure in California, right, everything from groceries to receiving medications to surgical expenses are much more, right? When we look at those expenses in California, costs a lot more. And so with this provision, right, it states the maximum amount that the insurer will consider eligible for reimbursement based on the average charges within a geographical area, right? So if you were to get, heart surgery, right, um, in Georgia, right, the insurance company might place a maximum amount of 5,000, right? Just hypothetical situations. In reality, probably cost a lot more. But in California, right, they might place a maximum amount for 8,000, right? Because, right, in California, the cost of living is much higher. And so the insurance policy, right, or a company takes account of that, right? Those geographical area differences as well. All right. So now let's take a look at reviewing through these provisions, right? Along with like a reviewing, there's some of these writers and policies as well, including, right, what we've talked about in life insurance, right? Those provisions we also want to, again, review and cover again. So let's go ahead and take a look at these two questions, and then we'll go over them shortly. Okay, all right. So for number one, it would be B, because it helps with that control of utilization of benefits, right? So instead of the insurance company paying 100%, right, we saw previously, right, we had that split, right, in which the insured would have to pay, right, maybe 20% of those medical expenses. Number two, we do have D, right? We looked at exclusions, and these also apply to life insurance, right? So whenever you see these questions, no matter in a life insurance or health insurance context, we want to know that they do hold true. All right, let's look at questions 3 and 4 here, and then we'll also go through them shortly. So when we take a look at number 3, we see that the insured has become disabled after 3 years. Three has been disabled, becomes disabled 3 years after his disability income policy is issued. But this disability is caused by a condition that existed prior to the policy issue date, but was not specifically excluded. So for this one, it's a little bit tricky because we want to look at the incontestability clause. And so if we look at a couple of things, first, it was not specifically excluded, right? So there was actually no exclusion stated in the policy. Remember, for these provisions to hold true, they need to be in the policy, right, when it was issued, right? That's why we have these provisions. And that's why we also have the entire contract provision that states right after it's issued, we can't modify the provision or modify anything in the application. And they can't also contest it, right? Because it's been more than that period of time, right? We looked at the incontestability period, right? And so in this case, it would actually, an insurer would actually pay the full claim. Now, when we look at number 4, eligible expenses provision. So most of, right, the medical, the surgical, and kind of the care, right, aspects of healthcare would be covered, right? So professional services of doctors, right? Hospital charges, right, for room and board, right? And healthcare, home healthcare would be covered. But typically experimental and investigative services
Oh,
are not
okay.
are not covered. So in that case, right, that would not be an eligible expense. So we kind of want to go back to review, right? What are some of kind of the typical expenses when we talk about major medical policies and looking at, right, room and board, right? These services and kind of home care is usually covered, but with um, typical, some types of surgeries or experimental or investigative services, they're not. Right. Right. Let's take a look at 5 and 6 as we're still reviewing through these provisions. We're still looking at and all in the kind of healthcare policy context. So for this one here, we'll first want to look at our legal actions provision, right? For number 5. So for this one, the answer would be C. An insured
Yeah.
must wait at least 60 days after proof of loss has been submitted before a lawsuit can be filed. So 6, for our benefits for drugs and alcohol treatment under a group health policy must include all of the following services except for transportation, right, to and from an
Mhm.
outpatient facility. So again, right, we all want to kind of relate this to, right, what are the eligible expenses, right? And so usually, right, treatment for sure, right? Outpatient treatment, yes. And right, therapy, right? That's prescribed by a physician, right? That's all, those are all types of treatment, no matter if it's inpatient or outpatient. As we know, right, usually, right, these transportation is typically not provided. So with some of these questions, we just want to think about, right, what is covered and what is not. And usually it is pretty obvious.